Good morning, everyone. Today is March 29th of the year 2022. The time is 10 a.m. And today's webinar is going to be on suicide prevention. As my teammate was talking about, we are recording this webinar. So your participation in the webinar acts as consent for us to do the recording. We do want to make sure that we talk about that if you have any questions today, we would like you to drive those questions towards the question and answer box. The actual chat box that we have, we're going to be using to provide you with resources and information. And my teammate's going to put some links and some other vital contact data into that chat log. So if we have questions, we ask that you be respectful because this is an open forum and go to the question and answer. So I just want to take a moment and welcome everybody this morning. My name is Sean Campbell, and I work with the California Transition Assistance Program. And we're here to help you navigate, and we want to really inform and connect veterans of all eras to the benefits that you've earned both federally and from the state, as well as provide you that continued support and assistance, because we recognize that your needs are going to change over time. And we've kind of identified 5 pathways: core curriculum, education, employment, entrepreneurship, and service providers. And these different pathways really give you a great opportunity to do some learning. There's self-paced modules that have videos as well as PDF downloads. If you're looking for some more information on the stuff that we have, we do ask that you provide a non-DoD email address, and you can see the QR codes off to the right side. Add us to your social media account, attend some of the webinars, and of course, the surveys that we generate and give out to you are extremely helpful. They help us design more webinars that meet the needs of you and veterans and service members and their families. I mentioned a little bit earlier about the 5 different pathways: core curriculum, education, employment, entrepreneurship. And this is just a snapshot of what our webpage looks like. If you look at the bottom where it's circled, you can also see some previously recorded webinars. Again, it's just a great tool for you to do that self-paced learning and find out a lot of the different benefits and programs that are out there for you in California. As a person who did 7 years in the Navy, working with the Fleet Marine Force as a hospital corpsman, I didn't know a lot of this information was out there until I really started exploring this website and webpage, and it's a valuable tool that you can use. What are some of the California specific benefits that are out there? There's a California tuition fee waiver for dependents of disabled veterans, veteran designated driver's license program, so you can get that designation on your driver's license as a veteran. Opens up a lot of doors for you. Motor vehicle registration fee waiver for from the DMV under certain eligibility. Reduced fishing and hunting licenses, no cost state park passes. Property tax and sometimes business tax exemptions depending on your eligibility. And the Department of Veteran Affairs, if you look on the right side of this slide, it shows you the different divisions we have. We have a home loans division that's out there to help you really empower you to get your dream and get that home in there. There's a women's division and a minority division. Those are to really expand a lot of the opportunities for those underserviced veterans out there, and the long-term care for people that are entering that aging and sometimes they need that additional care. And then when you're talking about your legacy, the Calvet, we do operate some cemeteries for the state of California, which are different from the VA cemeteries. Veterans Resource Book, my teammate Jana is going to drop a copy, a link of this PDF into the chat. This is an excellent tool to help you navigate through all the different benefits that are out there. And of course, va.gov, wonderful website. The VA operates this, and it will help you navigate through all different types of things, whether you're looking at educational benefits or what type of services are out there. Maybe you just want a copy of your DD-214 or look at your eligibility and the different types of healthcare. It's an excellent website, va.gov. Here's my contact information. If you have some more questions about the programs we have, by all means, feel free to contact us at any time. We're here to help you out and help you navigate through all the different programs that are out there. Next up is going to be Ben. Hello, Ben. How you doing today?
Good. How are you, sir?
I'm doing great. Ben is the local interagency network coordinator, and he's going to explain to you exactly how his job is awesome, and he just walks hand in hand with all the veterans and families out there. Thank you for being on today, Ben. I'll let you go ahead.
Okay, Sean, thanks so much. Good morning, everyone. So at Calvet, I'm what we call a link. One of the main jobs of a link is to provide information about benefits and services for veterans and their families. We also make direct connections to service providers, and I'll talk more about that in a bit. We do a lot of work by phone and email, and that's certainly a way that we can help you as well if you're a veteran or family member on this webinar and you'd like help. Next slide, please, Sean. Okay, so this is our link map. It's color-coded so that you can see the link that can best serve you depending on where you are in California. You can see the size of our regions differs, and as does the density of veteran population in the regions. But what's true for all of us as links is that we know our regions very well, and so we're in a good position to make connections to services that may help you. Next slide, please. Okay, so what do we do as links? We provide outreach to service members, veterans, and their families. We make referrals and work directly with established service provider networks. So one thing about how we work is, we don't learn about services by looking at web pages. We are in the community. We work directly with the providers that we end up referring you to. So we have good firsthand knowledge of what's happening. We assist with local emergencies. So a good example are California wildfires. We have our link team is often present at emergency response sites to help veterans with whatever emergent needs they may have. And we provide leadership and advocacy to local communities. So we're very involved in different types of collaborative groups across the state that help improve the coordination and delivery of services for veterans. Next slide, please. Okay, so connecting to benefits. So what are some of the benefits that we can connect you to? So we have a sampling here, and these are government benefits that are going to be standard across the state. It's obviously important to remember that there's a lot of nonprofits that are out there besides these government entities. But in terms of what's standard here with government, we have unemployment and training, the EDD, and their veteran-specific employment staff. We have the county veteran service offices, which exist in every state and provide very important help in applying for state and federal benefits. And on the health. Are we able to get to the next slide? Okay, super. Yeah, so that's it for me. Just a brief presentation. I think the most important point I want to reiterate is that, if you're a veteran out there, if you're a service provider, and we can provide information to you, please don't hesitate to reach out to us. My phone number is there. We have all our email addresses on that link map, which I know came through in a PDF. And yeah, feel free to reach out. Okay, thanks. That's it.
Thank you very much, Ben. We really appreciate you coming on and joining us today, and all the great things that you do for the different veterans and their families. Hello, Robert.
Hey, Ben, thanks for having me today. So good morning, everybody. It's a pleasure. I just want to take a moment to thank all of you for having me, Jana, Sean. Good to meet you, Alyssa, and Ben. I am the executive director of one of the sites of US Vets, a Pop Hope Patriotic Call, also the former director for the Suicide Prevention Center for Los Angeles. And I've been a licensed therapist for too many years to count, but over 20. But I really want just to get across maybe a couple of points today. I have a lot of information, and I really want to get you comfortable with being able to talk about suicide prevention today. And I'll tell you why. I'm going to talk a little bit about risk factors and some prevention ideas, but really just to get us all comfortable and take some of the stigma and the fear away from talking about this subject. So next slide, Ben. So just a little bit about Patriotic Call and US Vets. US Vets is the largest nonprofit working with veterans in the homeless space. We have 11 sites and over 27 residential sites and 9 service centers from DC to Hawaii, working with housing veterans, taking veterans that are in transition, some of them homeless, some of them about to be, getting them into stable housing, and then supporting them to get back to a permanent housing. At US Vets in downtown LA, which I shared earlier with some of the staff here, about to re-enter after 2 years of non-collective work. We have prevention and early intervention programs. Ours is the only site that is not affiliated with the residential site. We're really looking at the other end of the continuum. How do we help our veterans that are transitioning today move through that transition gracefully, successfully, finding stable housing, jobs? And the programs listed below outside the Wires of Mental Health program on community college campuses. Women Veterans on Point, as you can imagine, provides free mental health. All of these programs are actually free. Career Development Initiative can help any veteran throughout the state of California looking for employment. Our Vet to Peer program is also for anybody in California who wants to be trained to become a peer advocate. It's a free program partnering with Loyola Marymount, and our aftercare program is for veterans that are newly housed to help them stay stable housed. So next slide. So let me talk about suicide prevention today. This is just really what I would call sort of a primer, an introduction. Again, I don't want you to worry too much about the information. We'll leave some time. And also later, September 16th, we're going to enter our third partnership later this year with doing a full day seminar for first responders and veterans with the help of our friends at California Transition Assistance Program at CalVet. So let me move right into the topic here and give you just a little history. Next slide, Ben. So I thought this would be interesting to share at the Suicide Prevention Center here, right here in Los Angeles. Who started suicide prevention? As you can see from the WHO, it was actually 3 veterans who got together, and they were actually writing notes to widows from World War II who had lost their husbands or sons or family members to the war. But what they found out, there were a great many suicides after World War II, and so they began a clinical investigation at the VA hospital in Brentwood. And they started to look at notes that were real, people had left behind, and they asked researchers to manufacture some fake suicide notes that people left behind to see if they could tell the difference. This is important because it was the first time that they discovered this very important fact, which is that people that were dying by suicide did not want to die. In fact, they coined the phrase ambivalence, simultaneously wanting to live, but also having the desire to die. What this meant for them was we could intercede. It wasn't inevitable that somebody who was suffering from suicidal thoughts or desires would die. And they began the first suicide prevention center here. Shortly after Marilyn Monroe died, they were called to rule on whether it was an autopsy, in the autopsy, whether it was a suicide or a homicide. They ruled it was a suicide. And at that point, the phone began to ring across the country with people calling into their center, and it overwhelmed them. And actually, the first suicide prevention workers were their wives who picked up the phone and discovered there were people all across the country that were suffering from suicidal thoughts that had never understood there was something to do about it. So that's what we wanted to put across today. It is not inevitable, it is treatable, and it's something we can do today. And I'll show you how. Next slide. So the reality is there is still a huge need. This slide really demonstrates that back in 2019, there were estimated 12 thoughts of wanting to die by suicide. And out of those, about 10% were actually attempts, and only 3% went on to die by suicide. So that gives us some information that there's a lot of room to help people if we can get them to talk about their thoughts and get them into treatment. The most shocking fact about this I discovered while I was at the Suicide Prevention Center is far too many veterans were dying by suicide, making up almost 15% of the total deaths. And the reality was they were dying at twice the rate of their non-veteran counterparts, partially because of that next bullet, firearms. Firearms account for almost 60% of the deaths by suicide, much more than homicide. And the reality was that meant there was something also we could do about helping people who were dealing with suicide, who were in crisis. Most important point here that you're going to see right there is to remember this isn't just about veterans. Anybody can be at risk. In fact, statistics tell us that over 60% of us will know somebody who dies by suicide. That's more than half. And 40% of us, it will be a friend or family member. So I made the mistake many, many years ago of thinking suicide happened somewhere else. And in fact, it happened to 3 people that were associated with my family that I would later find out. So this means all of us can jump in and give a hand here. Next slide. So what makes a person suicidal? Next slide. So unfortunately, suicide is still a very complex issue with no single cause. And we're not really aware of all of the factors. I mean, today we're thinking there are complex interactions between biological factors. On recent autopsies, it's found that there was brain differentiations for people who died by suicide. So imagine we have a population out there right now who has a biological issue associated with being suicidal, and we have judged it, or we've thought it was just one thing like a bad breakup or maybe a mental health issue. So today we're looking at all sorts of factors. What we do know is if we identify some of the risk factors, what makes someone more likely to die by suicide, if we can identify those, we can actually help and identify the people that need our help. So the other thing about it, to prevent suicides among veterans or anybody for that matter, we have to look at what makes someone at risk for suicide and what are some of the things that protect someone from suicide. Let me give you a brief example of a physical issue like heart disease. If we know, if we go to the doctor and we have high cholesterol, a history of heart disease in our family, we're overweight, we're not exercising, and we're having tachycardia, irregular heartbeat, the doctor will check us every time, may put us on cholesterol medicine, will have us come back for regular checkups, would advise us to lose weight, would give us a whole prescription of things to do to really prevent the possibility of a heart attack. Well, what if we could do the same thing with suicide? Well, today we can. If we can identify the risk factors and encourage people to get to treatment, we can help save lives, and we can help take away the stigma that somebody with a physiological condition needs just as much help, whether it's psychologically originated or it's just a physical condition, as somebody with heart disease. Next slide. So here's briefly how some of the risk factors. Briefly, we know if someone has had a suicide attempt somewhere in their history, or if they're suffering from a mental health issue, that may make them more likely. Now, it's important to know that not everybody with a previous attempt or that's suffering from a mental health condition like depression or anxiety will go on to die by suicide. In fact, the majority of people don't. But if we look at those factors together, along with substance abuse issues, previous exposure to trauma, and somebody entering a crisis situation, then just like somebody with a history of heart disease, overweight, and high cholesterol being checked by the doctor, we should be able to talk to them. Have they ever had thoughts? And here's how we would do that. Next slide. So basically, we talked about those issues maybe being risky and maybe being not definitive where people will die. And that's because, as you see, there are a number of people who have thoughts, as we've talked about. Some of those people even have the desire. The desire is in green because the desire alone doesn't make it likely. It makes it that we should evaluate, but doesn't necessarily make it likely that someone will die by suicide. If we add a previous attempt, or we talk to the person if they thought about how they would die, now we have capability. That means it's slightly elevated. And then if we talk to somebody about their intent, so you've had thoughts, you've had the desire, you've told me you may want to do it this way, how likely is that to happen? And if all three of those are present, next slide, that'll lead to a potential suicidal crisis. So here's what happens to somebody who's suicidal, just to give us a little bit of an insight. It's somebody with those risk factors that has reached a crisis, and they're becoming desperate to escape the unbearable pain. Remember, they found out that people who died by suicide didn't necessarily want to die. They were seeking ways to live with the pain. However, when you become in crisis, your thinking becomes limited. If you look at what we were all through these last couple of years with the pandemic, a lot of us were forced to be isolated. We were forced to stay home. Well, all of us were. We were cut off from friends and family. We weren't traveling. We weren't in social situation. We only need 5 things to live: food, air, water, shelter, and strokes. We need to be connected. When we're not connected, we enter our own crisis. And many of us thought, when will this end? What are we going to do? We didn't think about the fact that we could go for walks or visit our relatives or stay connected, or we were worried about jobs. In other words, we had become very limited in our perspective. Next slide. When that happens, what happens is your mind sort of focuses. It becomes laser focused, or what we sometimes call constricted thinking. In fact, it loses the ability to discern what's really out there and what we need to focus on. It can lead to a lot of pain. It can cause us to think, I've only got a few options. If you've ever had a really bad experience, lost a job, broke up a relationship, in some financial stress, all of the above. What you know in that crisis is your mind is becoming laser focused to resolve the problem. However, that laser focus is good, but it's bad because it forgets that there are unlimited options around us. When people lose a relationship, I often remind them, there are over 11 million people in LA County. However, if you lost that one relationship, all you can think about is that relationship. It dominates your mind. And with those limited options, you sometimes think in ways that aren't healthy. It's all or nothing, or it's catastrophic, or it's something that will never change. And in fact, what your system does when you're feeling bad, it does something called emotional congruence. It starts to line up your thinking with your feeling. So if I'm feeling bad, I start to try to imagine or think of, why am I feeling bad? Oh, that's right, I've lost a relationship. Oh, I don't feel good. I'm probably not. Whatever it does, it is seeking to resolve the issue, but unfortunately, it's getting you laser focused on the problem and not how to resolve it. Next slide. What does that mean for somebody who's in crisis? It means that if we can identify these warning signs, and they come in 3 categories, basically our feelings, our behavior, and our moods, our attitudes, and always statements. So it's important to remember that if someone is indicating, if you have someone that's been dealing with a mental health issue and the depression gets worse, or if they're manic where the anxiety increases and the behaviors start to change, and these usually would be sudden changes, but they can gradually be getting worse, the person withdraws or becomes reckless or more agitated and isn't able to function as well. And you know they're in crisis and you know they may be at risk. Lastly, statements. One of the big myths about people who die by suicide is if they talk about it, they're not going to do it. In fact, what research shows is that people who die by suicide usually try to communicate it to us. Now, here's the key. If you learn nothing from this entire presentation, remember this. It is not easy for anybody suffering to talk about suffering and feeling bad. They're embarrassed, they're ashamed, they're afraid of what will happen. If you, all of you listening today, if you take away the fact that if I see that, if I can listen for it, if I can ask them, if I can speak to them, I might save a life, because they're not going to talk if I don't make it safe. And if I hear them talk about not wanting to be here anymore and not thinking life worth living, then I have to be brave enough to step up. And hopefully this one little presentation will give you that. Next slide. So basically, again, we often call these warning signs that imminent crisis is, about to happen. But warning signs can be changed to invitations. In other words, when we see people suffering or exhibiting some of these signs, and they may be in danger, we can talk about them. Maybe if they're just having a bad day, maybe if they're struggling with mental health issues, or maybe we're going to find out they're actually suicidal. Remember, suicide is still relatively rare. However, because we know it's out there, let's take the most safe sign here. So if someone talks about being hopeless, they're having trouble sleeping, they're having a lot of anxiety. Again, a lot of us had this the last couple of years and may still be having it. Doesn't necessarily mean in and of itself we're going to die by suicide, but it's just one of the possibilities. Someone has trouble controlling anger, they're engaging in risky activities, increasing use of alcohol or drugs, withdrawing from a family. That's the time for us to step up. And remember, we may be just stepping up to find out that this person needs some help. And we may be stepping up to find out that this person needs some help with us saving their lives. Next slide. So again, the other thing I want to do today is get you comfortable with the idea that everybody who talks about suicide or shares some thoughts of suicide or even the desire to die isn't necessarily going to die. So if we can get that through our head, that we can ask somebody, whether we're a clinician, a social worker, a therapist, a colleague, a friend, a family member, if we can understand that we can make suicide a part of the conversation, because people die by suicide every day, if we can talk about it and share what we know, then perhaps we can begin to evaluate what's happening around us with the people around us. And so there are 3 categories we want to look at, as I mentioned earlier, when we looked at that funnel. Someone may have the desire, again, it's in yellow, because it's a lower risk. It doesn't mean it's not a risk. If someone has talked about it or had a previous attempt, that makes the capability factor more likely, which means it raises the risk. And if someone tells you with intent that they want to act on the capability, that they've really been thinking about it, that they're afraid they can't keep themselves safe, that they're really suffering, then that's a high risk that you either want to get help, support by calling the suicide prevention line, looking at one of the resources, getting that person to a therapist, or if you're a therapist, getting some support from your colleagues to deal with that. The last one in green is more important. Remember, we talked about ambivalence. People who die by suicide are trying to live with the pain. And what we have to do when they're constricted and they're thinking and they forgot about their options, we have to make space for them to really begin to talk about those options in a way where they remember why they want to live. Next slide. I hope you don't hear about the construction next to me, but I'll try to get through this with that. So again, let's review those real briefly. So what we're looking at is desire, right? Have you ever thought of suicide? Have you ever thought of killing yourself? Now, I'm a suicide loss survivor. In other words, I have lost someone, and I mentioned in our family collectively have lost 3 different people. What that does is it introduces suicide into your thinking. And what it does when you're feeling bad is introduce the thought that, well, I could kill myself, or what about suicide? Now, that has nothing to do with the fact that I will ever want to do that, or even if I did want to do that or think that was an option. It's a relatively low risk. But for somebody with a different biochemical background or a different crisis or things that are intruding upon their life that they don't feel like they can resolve, if you add capability in that, have you ever tried? Do you have a plan? Now, have you ever tried talks about a previous attempt? Do you have a plan means you've gone beyond just wanting to die and you've actually started to contemplate how you would. Again, still medium risk. And the last one, intent. How likely would it be if you told me you wanted to die by suicide, that you were actually going to carry out the plan? And the reality is, some people would just say, no, I'm just having thoughts. And some people would say, 4 or 5, I'm getting ready. I don't know if I can keep myself safe. Now, let me give you a little key to this whole scale right here. These are questions asked on the suicide prevention line in Los Angeles and many of them across the country. Even if someone was a 3 or a 4 or even a 5, a good majority of the time, they were able to be de-escalated. They were able to be helped by paraprofessionals, oftentimes not therapists, to really de-escalate and remember why they didn't want to die. So the reality is we have got to be okay with talking about it. Doesn't mean you won't be frightened or you might not need help, and you certainly would not want to do it on your own. But you can call the suicide prevention line, you can get somebody to call, and they can help them with that and connect them to treatment. Next slide. So remember this factor. Again, if you take nothing away from today, this is your homework to write this word down, ambivalence. People who die by suicide are struggling to live. And they're struggling to live with a struggle that they don't believe is resolvable. So they're dealing with a lot of what Edmund Scheidman called psychache, a lot of pain, a lot of psychological pain. Imagine being in so much pain that you don't think you can live. That would be very, very difficult, very, very difficult, if not impossible. I liken this to, I got surgery on my leg a couple of years ago, and I remember going home from the hospital and I'd known about opiates, so I looked at the pain medication, said, no, I don't need that, and I actually didn't order it. I didn't order it because I thought, I'm not going to use an opiate. I'll just get through this. Well, as the night progressed after my surgery and the anesthesia wore off, I got in so much pain, I thought I was going to have to chop my leg off. I got in so much pain that I figured if this was not controllable, I did not want to live because it was unbearable. It was the very first time that I understood that concept of psyche, that somebody struggling so desperately is much, much different than just thoughts and desires. They're struggling to work it through and they need assistance. They may need hospitalization, medication, ongoing therapy, as well as, the support of friends and family. So we have to remember that people are out there right now with that difficult, if not impossible, situation. And we have to be the ones brave enough to understand that. Next slide. So how would you approach someone who's feeling suicidal? Hopefully you never have to do this, but if you do this, here's some keys on how you would do it. First and foremost, ask the question, are you thinking of killing yourself? Now, the reality, that's a very difficult question to ask. And we spend 8 weeks at the Suicide Prevention Center training volunteers on how to ask that question. It may be as simple as talking about, have you ever thought of suicide? Or I had a training in suicide, or I know something about suicide and you're a lot of pain. Can I just talk to you and make sure you're okay? Has that thought entered your mind? Have you thought about it? I know it's common for people with depression or anxiety that they think about it. Has that been part of your thinking? The most important piece of that, which is probably the most difficult, is remain calm. The easier piece, if you can train yourself to do this, is to listen. After over 20 some years of being a therapist, I finally figured out we don't have to have the answers to people's problems. We can help them problem solve. But most importantly, if we maintain a space to listen objectively without judgment and without trying to problem solve it or discount feelings or what somebody's saying, the reality is we can create a space for that person often to remember why they want to live or how to solve their problem. So when we share what's going on with you, we're really just developing a rapport. Now, asking that question means you want to listen to it. Most of the time we say, how are you doing? And we're on to the next statement. In this case, you want to slow down, listen, and ask someone to share, because what are you going to do? You're going to help them remember by gathering information on first the reasons they don't want to be here. Because if someone's that desperate and feeling that much pain, they need to talk about that. The very act of talking about it is going to release a lot of the pain and allow them to really deal with it much better. But it's also going to allow us to gather information about what's really going on. And through that, we can come up with that last part. We can start to look at, are there alternatives? So you're talking to me, and I know it's felt so bad that you want to die by suicide, but what are the reasons you're here? What's stopping you? What really is happening in your life? And what you'll hear is about relationship, about friends and family. Often tell people, having been exposed to suicide and having had thoughts of suicide, what I always remembered as a protective factor is I have 4 brothers. I do this work all the time. It would be very, 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 very unlikely, knowing that I would ever think about suicide. Now, I'm fortunate I don't have the psychological makeup of some people that have a bigger struggle because of maybe brain differentiations or different mental health issues. So it's never progressed back that. But the very act of identifying a protective factor that I would never put family or friends through that loss structure makes that thought evaporate almost instantly. Now, that's an easier case because I'm not suicidal, but for somebody who's struggling, it might help them deal with their ambivalence. Remember? Next slide. So here's how you manage a conversation about risk. We just have a few more slides and then we'll open up for questions. This was really a hard one for me to grasp, that first one, leaving suicide on the table. Yikes. Can I just tell them it's not a good idea? Can I tell them it's a long-term solution to a short-term problem? No, I can't. I can tell them that. But if I tell anybody don't do that, or that's a stupid idea, or I've heard people say that's a selfish idea, you immediately are going to cause that person to shut down because they know they're not okay already. And now you've affirmed they're not okay for the thinking they've had rather than help them problem solve. The thing you want to get to is ambivalence. How can I talk to you and help you understand maybe the reasons you wanted to die, but listen long enough to discover the reasons you want to live? And then the last thing is, hopefully I'm going to identify buffers. Next hit, Ben. And then I'm going to help the person discover alternatives, really. And next, hopefully I can get them into safety planning and connected to resources. Now, again, this is almost a therapeutic approach. So many of you may not have that skill. Many of you may just be able to talk about suicide and be able to listen. If you can do that, that's amazing. If you can help a person realize that they really don't want to die, and remember, the thought is nobody really wants to die. They just are struggling to live with the pain, and that's where we come in to get them to treatment. Next slide. So let's get into just a brief summary as we start to wrap this up. Again, I want to thank you for your attention. There's just a few more tips. So first and foremost, listen. Remember, the key here, if you are a problem solver, if you are somebody who cares and gives to people and tries to take care of them, it's difficult for us to listen without fixing. And it's important for us to know that listening is the most important thing we do. Being curious, asking them questions, not only about suicide, but what's going on? Why is it so bad? What's been happening? What you also may do is you may open up their mind in that moment. You may allow them not only to remember why they want to be alive, but you might uncover that ambivalence and really help them make sense. You also are giving them a place to have empathy. Remember those 5 things I said we need: food, air, water, shelter. What was that last one? Strokes. We need to be heard and known. We need to have people witness our life. We need to be able to share intimately about our worries, our fears. We need to be able to plan for the future or discover what's out there. We sometimes need to be reminded why we are alive and what's important. We have to have somebody to love, something to do, something to look forward to. And in the midst of a crisis, you forget that there are all around you people who love you. There are things to do and multiple options on how you want to live your life. Expressing empathy is not sympathy. Expressing empathy is saying to somebody, I recognize a struggle and it must really be awful. It's trying to go to a place similar to where they are, not where they are, so they know that you hear them. The first thing anybody has to know before they can hear anything else: have you heard how awful it is? Have you heard how hard my struggle is? Have you heard the reason I want to do this? Before you moved into, well, you shouldn't, or here's some options, or whatever. If you haven't heard me, then you don't understand. You don't have to understand everything, but if you understand that, you've automatically helped the person release some of the pain. Because the minute it goes out and someone hears it, it allows the person to assimilate it on a bigger, deeper level. Remember that in any mental health situation, the minute you hear a friend or family member struggle and you actually join them in the moment, you build rapport, you ask them what's going on, you empathize with it, you've automatically helped them begin the healing process. And through that, we hope they will discover the protective factors. What are the protective factors? The reasons I really don't want to die. But I forgot those when my thinking was constricted. I couldn't think there was a solution. When you're having a really bad day, do you ever remember that awful feeling and nothing seems right? And you can cascade into my life is worthless and I've made so many mistakes. And all of a sudden the solution pops up and you're like, oh, no, it's okay. And your entire mood and day can change. Well, imagine if you had to deal with that on a much deeper level, but you couldn't get to that second space of remembering why you wanted to stay here, what was important, because the pain was so intense. So the last part of that is discuss. If you ever do work with somebody or you know somebody, and again, if you don't have this skill or capability, you can refer somebody to a therapist. But if you can just start the process of getting people to come out and talk about their mental health and how to stay safe and what's going on, you can really support somebody. That last part, when we have our seminar later in the year on this platform, we will also talk about limiting access. The reason, unfortunately, so many veterans die by suicide is they have access to firearms. And again, if you're in a horrible situation and you can't think beyond what's going on and you have low impulse control or you can't problem solve, you are in risk of dying by suicide. And if we could just take that and put it away or lock it up safely or give it to a friend for the moment or make sure it's not accessible in a way that would be immediate, we can delay that. And if we can delay that crisis, we can stop it. Because oftentimes people who die by suicide will not switch to another method. And if they're blocked from the one method they would use, then the reality is it could stop the crisis altogether and save their lives. Next slide. Last couple of things. So remember I talked about those risk factors: difficult life issues, being isolated, having mental health issues, chronic stress. A lot of us had chronic stress during this period, and being in a crisis on top of it. Here are some of the things we can provide in support, either therapeutically or individually. Problem solving skills, the ability to help someone resolve an issue, again, by listening mostly, but you can also help problem solve. Connecting, helping them connected to people, resources, reminding us that when we're connected and not alone, because we never really are alone, then we can feel a lot better. Seeking treatment, developing resilience. If you're coming out of this period, I want you all to take this away from this presentation as well. You all survived this very, very difficult period, being isolated, being stressed, having to keep yourself safe, worried about loved ones, and you're still here today listening to this. So remember that about yourself, and remember all of those survival skills, the ability to take care of yourself, to take care of your loved ones, to stay safe, to stay focused, to stay productive, to take care of, your life around you. All of those will remind you and develop your confidence and your psychological resilience. And the last thing is, if someone's in crisis, we need to get them to support. One thing I learned at the Suicide Prevention Center when I was working with people who were actively suicidal was I would ask them, did you call the suicide prevention line, which was actually about 10 feet from where I was doing the group? And they would almost always say no. And I would say, well, what's the reason you wouldn't call that? Because I was ashamed, I was embarrassed, I thought they would judge me. So I would call it with them. We'd get the suicide prevention crisis line on the phone, because it's not only for people who are suicidal, but it might be for you taking care of somebody, or it might be for you if you're in crisis. Remember, those volunteers are there, they're available, and they want to talk to you. They want to be of service. So help people understand that. Last slide, I think last one coming up here. So how do you help a suicidal person? You have to ask. If you intuitively know something's going on, and somebody may be suffering, and somebody may be struggling, and they have those risk factors, the reality is you have to be the one that brings it up. A suicidal person will not feel safe most of the time. Thank you for that, Jana, the Veterans Crisis Line. And I think you have some other resources. Also, let me remind you about the Veterans Crisis Line. If you dial that number and don't press 1, you will get the Suicide Prevention Center closest to you. If you press 1, you'll be connected to the Veteran Resource Centers. Either one of those can help you. Some people don't want to call the veterans line, some of the veterans that we've worked with. So we give them that number and say, just don't press 1. You can talk to a non-veteran crisis line person, and they'll do their best to help you as well. The Veteran Crisis Line has this advantage, though. They can not only connect you to listen to you in a way where they're culturally understanding what you're going through a lot of times, but they can connect you to the appropriate resources that work with veterans specifically. So I just want you to take that one thing away today. If you think somebody's struggling, ask, be there for them, be the one brave enough to feel embarrassed or frightened or hesitant, be the one to step out, or if you are suffering yourself, be the one to ask for help. Because if you can do that, potentially you can save a life. And I think that's it, just under time. So we have some time for questions. I'll turn it back over to you, Ben, or not Ben, but Sean.
Ben's a good looking guy. I'm Sean.
Oh yeah. There you go, Sean. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Robert. You had a lot of great information about how to communicate to emotions. And really what you're talking about is just not a traditional skill that we learn in a traditional classroom.
Thank you. Yeah, no, I think that's why this work is so important. We often think that it happens over there, and we hope we never have to have that conversation. And all around us are people that are struggling. And some of them may just be having thoughts. But if they're a higher risk population, like the veteran community, we want to make sure we make it okay to let them know we are here for them. We are taking care of one another. I think if I've learned anything, it's how well veterans do that. And if we're trained to have a conversation in a non-threatening manner where we're not judging, we're not making a decision about what's right or wrong, but just supporting, empathizing, and connecting the person to resources, we can do a great service. So thank you for that. Absolutely, Sean.
Oh, thank you. You shared a lot of really important information. And I myself, I learned some really powerful strategies today. So let's open up some time for questions. Hello, Jana.
Hey there. So there really weren't too many questions at all. The only one that really popped up was just to ask if these slides could be shared. And I did put the slides in the chat, just a couple comments up. And then I also put some really great just extra resources for you guys. It's a PDF format. You guys can just download that. It's just right over the crisis line number there too. So far, that's really all that came up. If anything else does come up, I'll let you know, Sean, but I'll turn things back over to you.
Thank you. I do want to take a moment to put up a QR code for our post-webinar survey. If you could take that moment, like I said earlier, we really do value your feedback, and this data does help us to drive and improve our webinars and bring people to get some really great information. Speaking of other webinars that are coming up, we've got some great ones. Tomorrow's compensation and pension. We've got estate planning, legal services, expungement and discharge upgrades, different California benefits, CalVet programs, disability claims and appeals. And at the end of the month, there's one coming up on bankruptcy. Here is another one of our QR codes if you want to link us at Facebook or visit our webpage. QR codes are up there, and they'll be in the PDF version. If it's something that you want, you can always contact us and we can get you that PDF version of it as well. I'm looking at the question and answer box and see, it looks like there might be another question coming up for Jana.
Yes, I just saw a couple come up. So, Robert, this one is going to be for you. The question is, how do you speak to teens?
Oh, that's a great question. I didn't share this stat earlier, but the suicide is the second leading cause of death among teenagers. Actually, the majority of people that die by suicide, unfortunately, are older, 48 to 64. But teens, it is a concern, and I've actually presented to teens. So here's the really good news. Teens are so much more open than we are to the discussion. They're not as afraid, and they are curious naturally. So if you can open a conversation about mental health with them, and I presented to high school groups before, and talk to them. In fact, I just did it a couple of weeks ago for Ventura School District, and let them know it's safe. I begin the conversation with mental health in general, and then it's sort of a strange balance between understanding that suicide is still a relatively rare occasion, thank goodness. However, it happens obviously often enough that we want to be concerned about it. So you always have to walk the balance between making sure we don't normalize it. It's not an option that really obviously is normal and not the one the majority of people use. So specifically reminding them of that, and then the coping strategies, really helping people understand about getting help. Most teenagers that I've talked to, they know how to access it and they are aware. We make them aware, of course, of social media and the fact that that's not always a healthy outlet because it tends to present an overly optimistic position or pictures or stories of people who don't look like they're struggling, when the vast majority of teenagers, of course, are going through tough times. So normalizing the struggle, helping them understand, connecting them to resources, and reminding them it's okay to reach out for help. And like I said, they're naturally curious. They're really a joy to work with. And if you are brave enough to open up the conversation, they'll jump in it with you.
Wow, that's really, really great feedback. Thank you so much, Robert. I have another question that popped in for you. It says, what mental health service do you recommend for a veteran whose VA psychiatrist quit and vet center therapist moved, and they are still not assigned a new therapist 6 months later?
That's a really tough question, but it unfortunately is happening. If someone has that experience, what I would recommend is you probably do call. Well, in LA, there's the Veteran Peer Access Network. They will connect you to any, and it's VPAN. You can look at usvets.org, but you can also call the Veterans Crisis Line. Remember, a lot of times people confuse that the crisis line is just for crisis specifically, when in fact, if you're suffering from a mental health condition and your psychiatrist is not available, it is critical that you get help. They have a connection to resources often. There's also a veterans, I think, emotional support line, but all of those are hooked up to, for us, for women veterans, there's our Women Veterans on Point. You can also call check with our Outside the Wire program. We have access to resources outside of the VA. US Vets, thank you, Jana. So any of those, first of all, thank you for reaching out. Your mental health is critical, it's treatable. And if you're in a situation where you're not getting support because the resources aren't available, please do reach out. You can reach out to CalVet as well. Oftentimes, I think they can help you connect to resources as well. But I would try the crisis line or some of the resources listed on the page to see if you couldn't get connected to resources in your area.
Great. What is the youngest age to speak about suicide?
Well, that's a good question too. It varies depending upon the maturity of the person, but the earlier, the better that you talk about mental health. We generally don't go into schools, elementary schools, although we will deal with their teachers in talking about mental health and support. But if someone dies by suicide in the family and the child is older than 5 and has some beginning to understand, if you talk to a trained professional on how to present that and provide the resource. The interesting thing about children and kids is they get much more than we know that they get. They pick up the cues. They're pretty much like sponges. So it's all in how you present it, keeping it simple, keeping, again, depending upon the child's age, about the fact that it was a mental health condition. It was a physical, mental, and most likely a physical condition that this person suffered by, and that they took their life. That can be explained generally up 12 and above. But if you have someone that's skilled at doing it, like a therapist, you can work with kids from 5 to 12 as well.
Hey, that's some really great information. As of right now, those are all the questions that I'm seeing. Oh, wait, hold on one second. Okay, couple more actually just popped in. Okay, what if someone is serious about suicide, has a plan, and is determined to end their life? What should you do?
So then you're talking about a person, as we looked at, if someone has a plan and is determined. People who talk about suicide usually feel determined. The reality is that's where you intercede. What I would do with that person is I would probably get them to call the crisis line or get them into treatment, so that they can be de-escalated and supported and remembered. I've done presentations where people have talked about it. And the reality is, remember this, that the majority of people who are talking about it, and even though they're determined and they say they have a plan, what they're indicating to you is they're in crisis and they need some treatment and support. With that treatment and support, they can be, taken into an area where that is de-escalated and they feel okay. However, it's very frightening for therapists to hear that, or even friends and family members, that you have a plan and I think I need to hospitalize you. If someone is in imminent risk, which means they say they cannot stay safe, then that would be the time to call the crisis line or 911 and get some assistance. If they're in imminent risk, which means they have a plan and they're telling you they can't stay safe. Other than that, trying to get them the support and help into treatment. And the first part of that is accepting they have a right to have that thought and plan, that may be how they're coping. So if you tell them it's okay, and can we talk about it? Or if you're not feeling comfortable, can we get on the crisis line or to a therapist or a family member and talk about it? Then we can deal with it. If they still don't want help, then the reality is nobody from this presentation should ever feel responsible as if you have to save somebody's life. We cannot necessarily do that. All we can do is the prevention end, is looking at people in crisis. But if somebody indicates they're that far in their crisis, I would make sure either they have a therapist or the support of the crisis line. Good question.
Yeah, that is a really good question. I had responded to that too with that I imagine that other people had that question too. So I think that was a really good one.
Yeah. I was just going to say,
Someone-
a lot of therapists are afraid because they're afraid they'll get an answer that somebody is thought about it and is thinking they want to do it. Yeah, they have the desire and the capability. Now, remember, the last one is intent. How likely are you to do it? And if you still are feeling very likely and I can't de-escalate you, then I'd want to get you some help outside of myself.
Yeah. So a gentleman commented, why don't we go into middle schools and discuss this, bullying, etc. Children are future vets and first responders, so why not start early?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I think you should start early. I think we are working on something. Well, as I mentioned, I volunteer for the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention, aside from my job, and FSP.org has amazing resources. I actually did the presentation a couple weeks ago from 12 to 18-year-olds. Here's maybe not a news flash to everybody. We aren't evolved enough really to kind of roll it into curriculums. Parents are afraid, teachers are afraid. There's a myth out there that if we talk about suicide, it's more likely that someone will do it. That's not true. The opposite is true. If we talk about it and we get comfortable, we can de-escalate it. So there are programs. I do one as a volunteer. You can look at afsp.org and get help. Unfortunately, in this big area of 11 million people, there aren't near enough programs and support. So pushing on school districts to incorporate that. The resources are available, and people will go out like myself or do virtual trainings. That's an outstanding idea. The earlier, the better, to really talk about that and support. And there are Trevor Line and Teen Line, Trevor for LGBTQ youth and Teen Line for any youth in the area that can help as well, provide support. So those resources are available, and you're absolutely right. We need to be there.
Okay, a couple more questions just came in. What support is offered to those ES or ETSing that have experienced wartime trauma?
Okay, so anybody who has or is dealing with post-traumatic stress, and here's the thing we always want to be careful of, which you heard me qualify several times. People can be dealing with post-traumatic stress, whether a civilian or a veteran, and it doesn't necessarily make them suicidal, but people who are dealing with it. In my very organization, I've hired veterans that are still dealing with the PTSD that have been suicide loss survivors. Many veterans, unfortunately, know people who've died and have been close to people who've died by suicide, which elevates the risk. So what I do is I normalize and make sure we talk about it. In terms of resources, again, that's where you would want to check out one of the resources here or the crisis line to find out if it's a vet center near you, a VA center, or a nonprofit that's working with mental health. Our Outside the Wire programs on community college campuses working with veterans. We hope to continue to expand that in the next year outside of community college campuses for women veterans. They can call anytime and get free supportive counseling, whether it's, and it is trauma based care. So we're familiar with how to take care of trauma. It's a much more in-depth therapy. So you want to make sure you get to somebody who has a specialty in trauma and somebody who knows how to deal with it and de-escalate it. And I would start with the Veterans Crisis Line and the VA. If they can't do it, then I would begin to look at other resources outside of that.
Okay. What if you don't want to talk and you go to the chat and didn't get through the chat bot, just led to more frustration?
Okay, let's see. I don't know if it's the chat bot, which chat bot you're talking about. We have a live chat during the day for women veterans. So, and it is actually a live person that picks it up. I can tell you as well, the source of frustration in any customer service, the first question I ask the chat, is it a person or a bot? Because I understand that the question, it is very frustrating, especially if you have a mental health issue. So I would find an area like the Veterans Crisis Line again, or if you're women veterans, our Women Veterans on Point program is answered between 8 and 5 every day with a live person. The chat pops up. There is chat in the Veteran Crisis Line as well as just the crisis line. If you struggle with the Veterans Crisis Line and you want to just try that number, 800-273-8255, it will automatically, depending upon your area code, connect you to a crisis line in your area. So here in LA, the crisis line is actually, I think, just over in Century City, a few miles from where I live. They're 24/7. When I worked with people who were suicidal, actively suicidal and released from hospitals, one of the things I shared is call that crisis line because they are always available. Sometimes they do get busy, but it rolls into another crisis line. Best resource I can ever tell you. If you are struggling, chats and unfortunately texts, even though they're more convenient ways to talk, the technology is such that it takes a lot longer to answer a chat. So oftentimes the staffing doesn't keep up with the demand, whereas on the phone, you can get better service faster. So 2 resources. Again, try the crisis line alone if you don't want to talk to the VA crisis line, or press 1 if you want to connect to the Veterans Crisis Line. There's also an LA warm line where you can just talk and get emotional support. And I think there's a veteran warm line too. I don't have that number, but we can get that for you.
Okay, I can try to look for that as well and then post it. The person that posted that did say that it was the crisis line that they were calling. So hopefully the next time you'll be able to get through to that just fine and it won't be an issue. It looks like we did have another question that popped up. I know we're getting to 11 o'clock. How can you get therapy in San Diego when the wait to see a therapist is long, and the same with community health?
Wow, that's a tough question. And I think that's unfortunately, I don't know if I can solve that problem in the last minute. Again, the thing about the crisis line, remember, if you try the veteran crisis line, just dial that number without pressing 1, and it will connect you to non-veteran resources. They might have a wider list of resources available that have more access. Again, if you're in San Diego and dial that number, it will connect you to resources in San Diego. But I hear your concern. And here's where I'm going to say, I don't know that there's a good solution to that. Keep trying. If you're a woman veteran, again, you can call our women veterans line or text for women veterans on point, or just go to usvets.org. It'll connect you to that. But other mental health resources are still sometimes scarce. They're not meeting the needs. The good news is you're here today and talking about it, so don't give up. Continue to reach out, and hopefully in your area, you'll be able to find the right resources for you, because those lines are based in different communities. San Diego has a separate crisis line center than we do here in LA. Riverside has a different one. So generally they're connected to different resources, and you can find a better array. And with virtual therapy and support, if you have insurance, there are now providers who can help you outside of the VA as well.
Okay.
Janet, I can jump in there real quick. For San Diego, if you wanted to reach out to me, whoever put that in there, I can work with our San Diego link and take a look at what he's got his pulse on what's going on down there. So he might have awareness of what kind of clinics, and we can work with possibly 2-on-1 there. And so feel free, whoever that was, you got my email and phone number there. I can try to follow up on that.
Thanks, Ben. And I think there's county resources as well outside of the VA as well, right?
Good point. Absolutely.
Yeah. So, okay, well, this was such great information. I think that's it for all the questions. A couple questions haven't come through in the last couple minutes. So if anything does come through, I'll let you guys know, but I'll turn things back over to Sean.
Thank you, Jana. And I want to take a moment to say thank you to Robert, and thank you to Ben. And of course, thank you, Jana. I also want to take a moment to thank all of you for attending our webinar today. It is 11:02 a.m. So we're going to end the webinar here. And if you have any follow-on questions, or you're looking for some more information, do not hesitate to contact us. And thank you again for filling out the webinar survey. Have a great afternoon, and thank you again for your time.
Okay.
Thanks, everybody. Bye-bye.